This is Terry Pentremoli, Executive Director of the Detroit Jazz Fest, and you're listening to Detroit JazzStage.
Hello, I'm Rodney Reeves.
And I'm Jim Gallert. This month on Detroit JazzStage, we welcome M.L. Liebler and Ron English, two stalwarts of the Detroit jazz scene. M.L. is a longtime poet, sometimes disguised as a mild-mannered English professor. Ron English is a longtime guitarist whose licks have propelled many fine Detroit bands. That's this month on Detroit JazzStage.
The twilight blues descends upon the neon snake, electric city signs ongoing and going on, a language spoken in miles, road after all the other roads. It's another angel's wing waving goodbye to our city, broken spirits, spent confusion, everywhere separate, not equal, and we live here. Nobody saying nothing, turning blind eyes like double plays, dust, bottles, makeup, blue jazz wailing through the thin breeze on the eights. It's ghosts and birds. They live here now.
Well, gentlemen, on behalf of Rodney and myself, welcome to Detroit JazzStage, and it's a real honor and a great pleasure to have both of you with us.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I thought you're going to welcome us to Detroit. So.
Glad to be here.
ML, I notice among your many credits as a writer, an author, and in fact as an editor, that one involves Jack Kerouac's first wife, Edie Parker.
Oh, that is right. Yeah, that is correct.
And I wonder, because you're a poet, and Jack Kerouac obviously was a poet, a great storyteller. In fact, did his work have a great influence on you, do you think?
No, that's kind of a good question and an interesting one. I was not a fan of and didn't know much about Jack Kerouac growing up. All we knew is we were seeing some, at the time, we were kind of the young teenage poets in Detroit, and some of the older poets were often reading poems and dedicating them to Jack Kerouac. And as kind of young punk poets, we thought that their poetry was pretty bad. And whoever Jack Kerouac was not helping them. So we sort of shied away from him. And then in my last year of college at Oakland University, my very good friend and roommate, he had a history class where they read about Jack Kerouac, the Ann Charters biography. And he said, ML, we better rethink Jack Kerouac. I don't think he's this, jerk that we or bad writer that we thought. And that was when and he said, you better read On the Road. So I did, and we really kind of got into it. And then later in life, the Edie Parker connection was really kind of interesting, because I was in a restaurant on the east side of Detroit. I think it was called Ruby Taboos or something like that. And while I was in there, I was looking around at the walls, and he had all these weird little, pictures of black and white photos and stuff. And I said to the guy who owned it, who was kind of an eccentric dude, I said, God, this looks like a place that Jack Kerouac might, frequent. And he said, well, it's really weird that you said that, because his first wife is sitting up in the front. And I didn't know there was any Detroit connection at that point. And I said, what, are you kidding me? I mean, Jack Kerouac's first wife is sitting up in the front. He goes, yeah, she eats here all the time. And he said, do you want to meet her? And I thought, well, yeah, I guess, because I still didn't believe it. I thought this was insane. So we went up, and I met her. And she was a frequent visitor there, and at that time she was living in a cottage house in Grosse Pointe on Jefferson, which was full of artifacts of the Kerouac period. And she was amazed that anyone ever heard of Jack Kerouac. This This is where this all was at this particular time. So that began a really long friendship, and I became a very good friend of hers, and then we put out a book. She had the rights to some of Jack's poetry and photographs, and between that and her friendship with William Burroughs and others, we put a little chapbook together in 1982 that she was going to take with her, and she did, out to the 25th anniversary, I believe that would have been the 25th anniversary of On the Road, where all of these famous beatniks were amassing in Boulder, Colorado. And that book now is really expensive. I mean, it sold out immediately at about $30 a clip out there, and then now you can buy it on the used thing for quite a bit of money. But anyway, we became good friends, and then she took me out to Lawrence, Kansas in '87 for this week-long celebration called the River City Reunion for William Burroughs. And it was there that I really saw the deep love these guys had for her. She wasn't a fringe character. She was one of their good friends from the old days at Columbia University, where she met all of them.
Wow.
So there was a real bond there.
soft, the touch is fast, uptown and sweat, tears, high driving notes, we break our opportunity, break our opportunity. It's high, high, the jazz, yeah, the jazz. Beats and polishes everything, every damn thing, right down to the bone, to the bone, to the bone. Uptown and sweat, uptown and tears, it's high driving notes that break our opportunity, and it's a jazz. High, the jazz, the jazz, jazz, that's barking us back to the doghouses of our present land. So let us talk softly, let us talk slowly, and say no words, and just listen, listen. Can you dig what's happening? What's happening here? It's a blowing future barking us back to the doghouses of our present land. Yeah, it's a jazz. Yeah, it's a jazz. Magic poetry jazz. Right here. So when this is over, all done and over, let us say no words and just listen. Just listen. Just listen.
When did you see a connection between poetry and jazz? I mean, did it come like through blues and haikus or anything like of Kerouac's, or was it earlier you saw that connection? Or
Well, the thing about it, I thought about this coming out here because this is JazzStage. Is that what it's called, Detroit JazzStage?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, so I started thinking, okay, I better think about the jazz. Because I sort of came to the jazz part of things somewhat through the back door. I really was not a jazz fan, per se. I mean, I grew up on Elvis Presley, the poem that that I do about my grandmother raising me on Elvis at a very young age. And then the Beatles were very influential to me. As I started to... so at some point I wanted to marry poetry with music somehow. When we started the Ridgeway Collective in the very early 70s, one of the major figures in it was really into jazz music and probably listened to you all the time and Metamorphoses. And, these are things, public radio I'd never heard of before. I didn't know what this was. And he was totally into jazz music, in particular like Ornette Coleman and Sun Ra, and so jazz like that, Coltrane, Latter Coltrane in particular, and he was also very much into Ron and Shattering Effects and the Tribe, and he knew all that stuff. So he would play me music, Pharoah Sanders music and stuff like that, and I liked the craziness, if that's the word, of Ornette, or the spontaneity of Ornette Coleman, and I liked the Pharoah Sanders stuff, and I liked the Detroit stuff. Either I had to have rock and roll, or I had to have like this really like Ornette Coleman science fiction thing going on. So what I started to do when I first wanted to put poetry and music together is through this influence, I bought this album called Soap Suds by Ornette Coleman and Charlie Hayden, and which I recently found in New Orleans and on CD and burned a copy for Farouk. This was really influential because what I started doing is reading my poetry to some of these pieces in the early days and recording them. I had a little 4-track recorder in my college dorm room. And that's how I started out doing it. And so I guess in some way it makes sense that eventually I got hooked up with Farouk because I was reading to, his songs like Mary Hartman. He had these, I don't know if you guys know that album or not, but it was the kind of contemporary titles, but just spaced out jazzy saxophone bass stuff. And I would put my poems to it. But I would put my poems to chieftain songs and, whatever. I would make up songs and play guitar and flute and, bang on pizza tins and, do that and then read my poems on another track. So that, in a way, when I met up with Farouk, which was in the middle 80s, and I also liked Griot Galaxy.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that, I didn't like jazz, but I like that. Whatever that was, give me some more of that. And I had seen them a number of times and was influenced by that. So when I finally hooked up with Farouk, he was playing, to me, what sounded like that spontaneous Ornette Coleman stuff. In fact, many of those early poems we did set to Farouk's saxophone, because we used to just do a duo act where I would read and he would play. You know, that was the early days of what we did. We'd drive around and do shows all over the Midwest and stuff like that.
Progress. Jelly in the West. Jelly, 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 jelly. Jelly in the West. Jelly, jelly. Jelly stays on my mind. Jelly Roll killed his pappy and ran his mammy stone blind. I want to be an American. Here in the Valley of Tombs, we sat ten abreast on logs that stretched the entire length in this glade of unkempt mastaba. In this, the marketplace of the ideologues, the entire length of the room. In this galactic cowrie that bought the silence of tongues, I want to be an American. And so I'll gladly barter the wreckage of my legacy to prepubescent spin doctors who have no truth to know, while we sat ten abreast on logs that stretched the entire length of the room. Because surely, dear brother, the last time I saw nothing was in the vacant gaze of the moon, or as a crack in the shattered eye of the hero. Before true no thing became emptiness in the hands of nihilist hunter-gatherers, the spawn of Conan, flirting with absurdity, courting the random. And I want to be an American, licking pus in the glistening halls of revisionist history. I said, thank you, Jesus, Sister Beatrice said, I want to be an American. Jelly in the West, jelly, 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 jelly.
So poetry and jazz, to me, are very much linked by people like you mentioned, like the Beats, Kerouac, and he even did the poem about Charlie Parker and his ancient padoodle stick or something along those lines, which I think is wonderful. But and then even people like Ken Nordine, with his word jazz is he worked with a lot of different jazz musicians.
Oh yeah.
But then again, recently it seems to have shifted. Even Ken Nordine did an album with Grissman and Garcia, which was more of a bluegrass thing. Is poetry and jazz still relevant, or has it turned to more of the independent style of rock music?
Well, I think I think it's still relevant. I don't think it's happening in the traditional sense of what people might think of when you think of Kerouac doing it, or even Ken Nordine. I still think that it happens to some extent, and it's recorded. I mean, locally, John Sinclair, I think, does a really good job of both blues and jazz with it. It's a different thing than what we do. I mean, he's kind of capturing an oral history with the music being played, where we're kind of writing poems. I'm speaking of Ron and myself and Farouk. We're writing poems, and then we're bringing the sound of the music that we hear to it. So it's still kind of a small market, if you will. It's not, which is what I like about being in a poetry band, is we're not competing with, the 1 million rock and roll bands and the 200,000 jazz bands, because it's different. And when people hear it, they tend to think, this is pretty interesting. It's got good music, and you're actually saying something that I have to think about, because thinking's not really big anymore. But it is for a small segment of the population, and that's who seems to pick up on this.
Ron, is this the first band you've worked in that you feature some of your own poetry? I mean, have you worked in bands with where you had a poet as one of the instruments, so to speak?
No, not as a regular band, no, but going back to the late 50s, early 60s, on campus at Michigan State, there's somewhere I have a photograph of me with with reading a poem, and I know what poem it was. It's something influenced, kind of, in imitation of Dylan Thomas's very lush kind of style, and a wonderful piano player named Russ Stump. Is in the microphone cord. It's kind of draped over his shoulder, and we're on the front porch of a YMCA house or something like that. And the microphone is draped over his shoulder, and he's playing round about midnight. And I'm doing this very romantic, lush-sounding poem.
Wow.
So that kind of thing, because I grew up in that, or I should say this, I went to high school in East Lansing, and so on our lunch hour we could go downtown and go to the bookstores, and we ran across. That's how, as high school students, we had run across the City Lights books, and we'd run across Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and then we found Howl, Allen Ginsberg, and all of those things, and Gary Snyder, some of his first stuff that Ferlinghetti was publishing in that, and so that was a world that we entered into. Plus, we knew about, because Bird had died while we were in high school, and so we knew those records. I loved the Jerry Mulligan 10-tet that was in the record stores. Miles Davis, I think that Miles Davis on Columbia, where he does Round Midnight and Alucha and all of that. That came out in about '56. And I had made bus trips into Detroit, and there used to be a really hip record store somewhere between the State Theater and the Fox Theater. And that was the place where they had all the hip stuff, and that's where I first heard. We'd come down to here probably. It might have been the weekend we came down to hear Duke Ellington and Stan Kenton opposite one another at the Greystone Ballroom.
Wow!
In one of the last shows, that they did there, and. But we heard Kenny Burrell and Delilah and all of those things, and also heard Miles's Walkin'. So that was the kind of the jazz milieu that I came up with, and that was the kind of poetry milieu that I came up with. And we'd heard that these beatniks that seemed like very cool people to us, as teenagers. And we'd heard that they were doing jazz and poetry. So it was an idea of something, well, this will be something that would be cool to do, but it presents formal issues, like how are you going to make this work? Because, a song form and a poem form, each of them has its own form. And what we've happened on finally now, many years later, far down the road, is developing a kind of music that we have a few things that are song forms, but mostly it's essentially a vamp. It's a wallpaper piece of music, but that morphs over the course of time. Before we started this interview, we were reflecting on, or you had mentioned ML, you had mentioned jam bands, like the Dead and so forth, and how a piece can, with fairly, how shall I say, a limited form, but it can go on and in a free kind of way can morph from one thing into another. Well, that sort of approach works fairly well if you pay attention to what the poem is.
Right.
So the short answer is no. Never worked in a band that had a poet in it before. Yeah, we are doing something that's different here, but it does have antecedents. This is called The Blower, or with Baudelaire and McClure at the Roncevaux Chorale. Roncevaux is where, in the Middle Ages, a great hero named Roland fought to the last man in a rearguard action, which is sort of what writing a poem is like. McClure is the poet Michael McClure, who had a great line about huge figures. And I don't remember why Baudelaire is in there. It's an old poem, but like a lot of poems, it's partly about itself. And it's about how hard it can be to express yourself, whether it's in a poem or explaining something to your family, when you have to bring together a jumble of thoughts, like being dealt a low hand, like a dog from every town, and on the spot, you've got to try to pull it together. So this is The Blower. Or anything like it is a convention where the dead come back, hunt beasts, stalk water buffalo, and shoot each other into each other all the way back to afterwards. Away. I'm the marshal. See this? Baton, gold hat, flutter of ribbons, an elephant horn for the judges, and marching bands, 42 marching bands, and all the dead the hotels can handle, marshaling anything huge I've got into me towards you, even a drugstore. What you need, Sonny? A Robitussin AC, sir. Is this cough here? Sign your right name here. Afternoon, Marshal. What brings you in? Oh, this your boy? Smart young feller. Say, I seen one of the Dalton boys on the street sometime yesterday hanging out. Say the whole gang's back? And more besides? My, thought you rounded up them boys sometime back, Marshal. Hog damned, ain't we? Is it weird? Is it fatal? Is it fated? Or is it a spirit that gets the words moving, or birds wheeling toward you, dip, and the sudden rush and clatter of their bones punctures the sky. The sky's the ground for the huge figures, their glint and splash, costume and stance, the strut and threat, rich hour of robe, a metal waterfall moving toward you at the gesture of the marshal, all the figures shooting each other into each other,
The horn blows, a metal waterfall among the gathered dying. Ta-ta-ta-ta. Convention. Rally the dead. Call the living. The advance party pokes their faces around the rocks. They filter into the fade and carnage. Strong ones blanching, the young observing the sunset or the gloom creeping into the engraving near the edges of the picture they find themselves in. And a few hunched on one knee saying, "What is this? What?" You said, "What?" To last words. They're all last words before the fade. Because he blew it. He blew it back. Back to afterwards. Away.
Were you playing guitar when you were reading that poem on the campus at
No.
MSU?
Oh, no. No.
When did that come, the guitar?
Well, probably on a different tune.
Oh, no, but I mean, you were playing at the time, though. I'm sorry, you had studied guitar. And you were a musician
Yeah,
at the time.
by the time I was 17, I knew I was a poet and a musician, and that I would always be both of those things to one extent or another. And what happened was that the musician part, by the time I got to my early 30s, late 20s, the musician part really took over for the next many, many years. And it's just been recently that the poet part has started to reassert.
We had to rein Ron back into the poetry fold.
Now, when you came to Detroit, I've seen that picture of you at the Detroit Artists Workshop with Charles Moore and Danny Spencer, and I think John Dana's on bass.
Yeah,
and Larry Nazaro, I think,
and
is
Larry's in there
right.
on reeds. I mean, what was Detroit like? This is in 1964, I believe. What was Detroit like at that time?
Well, it was the cool place. It was the place where energy was emanating from. Charles Moore once made an observation, somewhat invidious to Ann Arbor. He said Ann Arbor is the kind of place where energy goes to. Detroit is the kind of place energy comes from. And where East Lansing fell in that, I'm not quite sure. But the point was that there was a lot of things going on. There had been a lot of things going on, and there were a lot of real beatniks around. Win Wells and other people that were. What shall I say? Catalysts, the kind of energetic sort of people that Neil Cassidy was looked down at, but real beatniks. But the arts were kind of around this, so there was a yeasty sort of atmosphere even before we had been there, and then we found out that there was a long tradition here as well. James Seamark, who was one of the people at the Detroit Artists Workshop, John Sinclair, and that's where, again, you saw that photograph where the Detroit Contemporary Five, they were kind of the house band for that. James Seamark had done an interview for one of the publications' work with Harold McKinney, and Harold was around when Kenny Burrell and Harold, and when they did at a place called the Sea, they call it the World Stage,
yes.
And the Musicians Brotherhood presented the shows there. So we realized, okay, well, there's a tradition of this kind of activity. So all of that was in our minds, and we were conscious of all of that while it was going on. The situation at the workshop, we didn't have the jazz and the poetry. They were kind of separate things. At that time, Robert Creeley was extremely influential, as some of the Beats had been as well. But Creeley in particular, and the emphasis on reading. Now Creeley is this, as you know, is this very dry, very subtle New England man who speaks very softly, but the emphasis on the spoken word, on the line, on the breath of the poet was very influential on all of us, and that very strong tradition of the poetry to be read, right. to be heard, poetry to be heard, and really which has affected everybody since then.
When you came on the scene, I'm assuming that you were playing a more traditional straight-ahead kind of jazz that might be more in favor with what the beats we're listening to, like the bebop influence.
Well, it's kind of funny. The music that we really liked was the things that I mentioned that I liked in high school was bebop, and the little 10-piece thing that Jerry Mulligan had, and Miles's quintets, all of the Miles quintets and so forth. We love Miles and the players that I came up with in Lansing and in Detroit. But there was a bass player that came around East Lansing. I think his name was Scott McKeon, but he was the first guy that said, "No, you need to listen to Ornette because something is going on there." So from an early time, from 21 or thereabouts at that age, I and all the people that I hung out with, Bud Spangler and Danny Spencer, we all had our ears open to everything that was going on, which was Ornette, and people call it the free thing at that time, and or playing more open forms. And because as we began to do more and more composition, especially later on in the 60s, at the time, the Detroit Creative Musicians Association, working with other kinds of meters, working with other kinds of open forms and so on. And it really was a blended style. And if you listen to griot, really, these are forms, these are structures that they were creating. Really, anybody from that period, to one extent or another, is playing off from not really traditional bebop. I mean, it really is post-bebop, and the influence of Ornette is everywhere. The influence of Coltrane is everywhere. But some people have more of a bebop substrate, and some people, develop more of it as time goes on. And I would include myself in that group.
Sure.
I become more of a bebopper as I've gotten older.
ML, could we get you to do a reading from your book?
Yeah. I think I have a new book coming out in April that's all poems written in different parts of the world, Russia and Israel and I forget what other parts. But anyway, this one has a lot of poems in it written in China and Alaska, actually. But this poem kind of sets up where I come from in the musical sense. And sometimes we perform this piece, and it's called Rock and Roll. Maybe not the most appropriate for Detroit JazzStage, but it's true. This is a true story. My grandma taught me how to rock. She hummed Elvis while she hemmed my pants. She liked Elvis. She liked him so much that she bought me a black leather jacket with zippers and a motorcycle hat like Marlon Brando's. That really pissed Mrs. Taylor off. She kicked me out of first grade. She said I'd be a bad influence on all the other kids. I didn't like those snotty-nosed kids anyway. They couldn't rock like Grandma. So that's a true kind of autobiographical.
You've got to let us know where you went to school.
Well, I always grew up and still live in St. Clair Shores, and that would have been like the elementary school. And Grandma loved. In hindsight, you think your grandma's ancient, or grandmas are ancient, but in hindsight, she was really like in her early 40s. And when Elvis came out in 56. That, with Hound Dog and All Shook Up and those songs, she just took to it, man. And so she bought me this album when I was 4, and I played it, and I was very influenced by it. And then she thought she was always doing the right thing. She bought me a nice leather jacket. She bought me the hat. I went to school. I do remember that, and the teacher was just freaked out because it was back in those days. And she said, Mister, you have to go down to the principal's office. You cannot stay in school like that. And my grandma was really pissed off about it, because she spent good money at Federals on this equipment. So she raced back to the school and was angry at them and so forth.
When we had Farouk on the show, he did a lot of he gave us a lot of information on his thoughts on language and melodies. And I know you're quoted as speaking about the same subject. When you write your poetry, do you think of it as a melody line? Are you thinking of it as a musician?
No, I don't. I really, that is one thing that is true of my stuff that I put to music, is all of it is poetry that's been written and usually published, and then the music comes to it later. And an example of that would be, hypothetically, if Farouk and Ron come and they play a tune. I might search for a poem. I'm always looking for music that has what I say sort of a poetic feel to it. Not all music is like that, and not all musicians do that. Mm-hmm. I found that kinship with certain other people, and I've recorded, like with Al Cooper. Jorma Kaukonen hits that note for me sometimes, like with his solo stuff. I'm just looking at some of the people on the CD there. And so I look for, Mike Watt does it for me. I look for certain poetry or poetic music in that sense. And what often would happen is either I'll come to him, like with Floating. I came to the band, which is the second song, I believe, on the CD. Yeah. And I came to them and I say, and I'm famous for this, and they always laugh at me, but then they do it right. But I just came and I said, I want, something that kind of it chugs along and it's like doon 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 doon. Do that. Just do that for me. And then they start doing it, and then they start making it better, and then I can jump in with the poem. The same thing was true of In a Window. I said, play this funk stuff that's kind of dun 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 dun, and then they do it. So sometimes that happens, or other times the musicians will bring, like Brooding the Heartland, Ted Nagy started playing this music, and it's on our CD, but the original version of it. And he started playing it, and a good example of this is I have my books with me, and I start, what kind of leafing through it. What poem is going to work here? What's going to happen? And a lot of these pieces that are set to music sometimes had another poem, on the early takes of it. It's a different poem, and And it takes time, as Ron said, as you work and work and work it. You get tighter, you find the nuances. That's when the band is happening for me, when they get to that stage, which we're at now. Took us a while to get there, but once you get there, then you can play off my movements, and you guys can play off each other.
We're very fortunate to have there's four musicians in this band, me and Farouk, and Billy Hewlett on drums, and Jeff Reynolds playing bass, and also doing a lot of the engineering on this CD, and some of the mixing and some and some of those technological effects and so on, and. They both got a background in a real broad variety of music. They got encyclopedic pop kind of background, and then and as I say, Farouk and I bring to it what we have, and so that's the way we're able to do that. And the other nice thing is that they lock up good and strike up a nice strong groove.
Yeah.
Butterfly's tongue in the artist's eye. An occultist whose only promise is a vast vacancy at the end of a dialectic process, and a frame that values only the endless patter of the unveiled id, or so it would seem. The model of the artist as lone individual, alienated by the angst of a painfully refined vision, while flashing the gaudy display of Midshipman Geordie's visor, and there tapping a theme, a sphere of being that lays claim to universality, to Jungian archetypes draped in the refracted regalia of affected image. This from an intuitive plane, we are told. In an aesthetic where only motion, only form is measured, where content is at best an extensive vapor, a whisper in passing. Being driven mercilessly into ourselves, our poems become glowing reports from hell, festooned with image from the bellies of pigs. This one who would bargain our art, our lives, lies limpid at your door, a wasted carrion feeder, a haiku of this moment. These ancient remembrances move my centering to a point outside the realm of concerns, given voice by the images of glistening wings of Heru and a covey of Egyptian hawk gods at dawn.
Ron, you have a new album out, and it features some of the best jazz musicians in town who happen to also attend your church. Is that correct?
Some do, yeah. Some do, and some did, and yeah, we do. Essentially, the core of the band is usually guitar and bass. John Dana and I were attending Rosedale Park Baptist Church, and Gerald Cleaver at that time was a member of that church. Now he's now moved away. Gerald lives in New York, and he's been very active with Jackie Terrison and a lot of other people out on the set. But I talked to Gerald recently to get his permission, to finally release this thing. I've been working on this thing literally for years, but we. Actually, around the time that we were doing that, I got appointed minister of music at that church, and there were a lot of other things that kind of needed attention, and so in the later '90s, that was in '92, and we recorded some of this stuff in the literally in the mid '90s. And later on in the 90s, there were some other things that we needed to do within the music ministry there. And so it kind of got put on the back burner. But then about 3 years ago, a member of another church, a historic Fort Street Presbyterian church downtown, said, we're looking at doing something, we have a traditional liturgy, but we'd like to do something different with some of the music. And I said, funny you should ask. And so that's how we've been doing that, and we rely on guest artists. Now, our regular drummer had been a young man who had literally grown up in the church, started out playing bongos and took to set drums, and he's broadened his experience. He's not performing with us right now because he just took a job as a journalist over in Battle Creek. He just started working over there for the Daily over there. But Sean Dobbins is filling in for us very nicely, and at Fort Street when we do there, and some of the and then we do the regular jazz thing as well. But some of the people that appear on the CD are. Dean Moore plays saxophone, and he's appeared with us at both churches. And Dennis Lee from the Lee family. Now he's a member at Rosedale, and there's also a vibes player that's on some of the cuts. John Melhado, he was a member at Rosedale. And Racy Biggs is the co-producer, and he was the engineer and mixer for this whole thing. And it would not have happened without Racy Biggs, and he's on trumpet on one of the cuts. So Rick Rowe is on piano on a couple of tracks, and then there are a couple of small vocal ensembles. Three of the tracks, actually 9 or 10 tracks on the record, but 3 of them have a small chorus. A couple of the pieces are settings of scriptures, and one of them is an old revival song, reharmonized and given a different beat, which is what happens with a lot of the stuff. A lot of the stuff is the old spirituals and so forth. And these are the things that we play as part of morning worship, but it's all using the jazz language. One of the things I said about it is that we were all of us who were in that church. I mean that core trio that really started this, Gerald and John and I, were aware of the power and the spiritual weight that's available in jazz improvising, and we wanted to, and we're also aware of how it's intertwined with gospel music and really going back to the Negro spirituals, and that the development has influenced one another over the years in ways that you can very specifically document. And we wanted to bring the language of jazz that we had developed and bring it back home, so to speak, and integrate it into worship. So that's part of what it is. But what I'm finding is a lot of people listen to this as a jazz CD. It's like, yeah, man, it's a jazz CD, and become aware of the some of the content and some of the intent of it sort of seeps in.
Why don't we listen to one of those pieces?
Okay.
ML, it's been a real pleasure talking with you, and thank you both very much for gracing our small studio here at Longview Sound, and we hope that I know we'll run into you on a gig someplace,
Or in a classroom.
around town or in a classroom, spreading the word, the music word, the word of music.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Great.
Thank you.
Very nice.
AllAboutJazz.com is your premier online jazz destination for daily reviews, interviews, MP3s, calendars, upcoming CDs, and the most active jazz bulletin board on the web. All this, plus over 14,000 musician profiles, makes All About Jazz the spot for enthusiasts and professionals alike. Time magazine calls All About Jazz a great starting point for the jazz newbie and a plum resource for serious jazz lovers, too. Join the other 1.5 million readers worldwide and discover the hottest joint for jazz on the web at allaboutjazz.com.
Hi, I'm Rodney Reeves from JazzStage Productions. If you enjoy listening to Detroit JazzStage, we encourage you to leave your comments on iTunes. Doing so will help promote our show and keep us bringing quality shows to your iPod.
Detroit JazzStage is produced at Longview Sound in Metro Detroit for JazzStage Productions. Dean Sahutsky, executive producer. Mark Byerly is our sound engineer. I'm Jim Gallards.
And I'm Rodney Reeves.